back to the WellZest Podcast. You are in for a power-packed episode today because I have Dr. Mala with us, and I'm just beyond jazzed. All of her wealth, knowledge, incredible experience. You guys get to have just an incredible episode today talking with Dr. Mala. So Dr. Mala, welcome to the podcast. So excited to have you on.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, Teju.
Amazing, amazing. Dr. Mala, you've done so much. I want to actually go through your bio because it is
Yeah.
incredible, inspiring, all the things that you've done. So, for everyone, Dr. Mala is a psychologist who bridges the worlds of Western science and Eastern philosophy to offer deeply integrative healing. With expertise spanning trauma, military psychology, family systems, and somatic wellness, she's helped everyone from executives to athletes and families navigate life's most complex emotional terrains. Her work goes beyond symptoms into the root, the body, and the story behind it all. Just incredible, incredible your career, your journey, everything that you've done and are working on. I know we were chatting a little bit about some of the incredible projects that you have, which we'll get to later in the episode.
Yeah.
But what I would love to do is just take a minute and pause and
Mhm.
talk about who you were 20 years ago, 30 years
Ah,
ago. How did you get into the work that you are doing right now? What transpired it? Walk me through your origin story.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, my goodness, I think I've always had an inclination towards just healing, in general. And my journey into the field of psychology and mental health and wellness really has its roots in my childhood, where I experienced childhood-based trauma through a distant family member. Was a really bad situation, of course. Um, and I realized even at that age, I was voiceless. I felt voiceless.
Mm,
And I could hear echoes of, the people that I love, my mom, for sure, spearheaded just trying to even find her own voice to be able to protect me in so many different ways. And aside from that, it was me growing up in as a minority in a very limited, not diverse little town in Michigan. And it wasn't diverse at the time, I would say, when I was growing up. And I unfortunately did, face a lot of discrimination, and I felt very left out, very isolated, um, and had, a beautiful little tiny group of friends that, I did lean on and was able to lean on. But even then, like I was very, very aware of the fact that isolation didn't feel good, right?
right.
Isolation could be detrimental, right? And I saw so many other people, as we all do, end up encountering that in their own ways with their own journeys and then go down different paths. And so this is me as a child, essentially seeing this and analyzing this and thinking, wow, I have choice, you know. And that was a concept that was definitely reinforced in my upbringing, is that you always have choice, right? So that anchoring point was essentially what made me, and I would say helped me through what could have broken me. And in several ways, whether it was the discrimination, whether it was, the trauma that I encountered, both could have broken me. Um, but I was able to embrace choice and choose a path that would essentially help me get enriched myself and then be able to decide to provide that enrichment for people as I grew up and went into the field of psychology. And originally in college, so you asked about 20 years ago, when I first started my university track, I was dual enrolled. Um, I started with biopsychology and cognitive sciences, and then I did my minor in Latin American studies, and I was like, I
Oh,
think I'm
wow.
gonna do both,
Right.
you know, and then in some way, shape, or form. And then I fell in love with marriage and family psychology.
Mm.
And there's only one program at the time in my state that was offering that at the university that was close by. I had to turn down my acceptance to Columbia, which was not fun because my parents were like, no, we want you to stay home and we want you close by. And I was like,
Oh
darn it. But
man.
that's
Oh,
okay. I know it was a bummer, but it's okay because, I found my love with marriage and family. And I also wanted to pursue education simultaneous to that. So I was actually getting certified to be a K through 12 instructor, and teaching while I was doing my marriage and family psych degree. And it was so fulfilling because I felt like I was getting, so many facets of that world. I was getting the kids, and working with them and, focusing on all things ESL and, language arts. And that was beautiful. And doing so in a district that was not great. They had their struggles. And so it was really meaningful for me to be able to be in that environment while I was going to school. And then my advisor, in university was like, you have this knack for psychology. Like, you need to just focus on this. Like, just, go for this, like, take this far, like, do it, right? You can still teach, but
right.
like, I see the spark in you. So you need to pursue that. And I embraced that and I just ran with it. And so that's what took me through my doctorate. And
Wow.
also, my motto from an educational standpoint is, of course, we never stop learning,
Right.
but I always wanted to have as many doors open as I possibly could because my mission very quickly became enhanced in that, like, it was a robust mission statement that formulated through the history. Where I landed was, I want to be able to work with as many people as I possibly can and impact positively as many people that I can.
Right.
So that's what led me down, wanting to pursue all the specialties that I have and work with different populations. And being from an environment that was very limited in terms of support, especially from a cultural perspective, I was very set on making sure that I could learn or be proficient in providing services and being an ally to as many different communities as I possibly could be.
Right.
So,
Amazing.
yeah.
What a journey. What a
Yeah.
journey. Seriously. I mean, you've just done so many things and, we're able to take a passion and find different facets and different ways to be able to, be a student of, the discipline so that you could really lead and teach and empower so many people. I want to go back, if you're open to it, to that period of childhood trauma. I think unfortunately it's something that in our society happens more often than
Hmm.
we care to
Hmm.
talk about.
Yeah.
We don't talk about it. A lot of people,
Hmm.
I've had a very similar situation, in my childhood with a babysitter,
Hmm.
and I think people hide it. It's taboo,
Yeah.
and children then are left unpacking
Hmm.
difficult situations without the
Yeah.
tools, without the resources. So, I want to ask you, in a very vulnerable way, as much as you want to share, what happened? Did you have any resources? Did you feel like you were supported? And what did that, how did that transform your worldview?
Oh, yeah. Unfortunately, because what I experienced was within the family system. Although I
Mm,
mentioned to you it was distant because they did not thankfully live with us.
right.
Um, it- they were still intimately involved with my mom and my dad, in terms of the family relationship. So that did make it very challenging. And this person was still in essentially the family system until they passed away.
Wow.
So, for me, in terms of the feeling of support, what I can tell you is that, I remember thinking to myself, is this how you get accepted?
Mm,
Is this my way of being validated? If I submit to this,
right.
then will this make my life easier? You know,
Mm,
so as a child, and this started when I was 4,
wow.
so as a child, I remember thinking that because again, with where I was brought up and where we were settled, it was very limited. I was very limited with who was in my circle and who I felt accepted by.
Right.
And more often than not, I felt accepted by the adults,
Right. Right.
and it was, the teachers that were kind, and, the parents of my friends and the friends that were close, who were definitely there for me to lean on. Now, there is, of course, the cultural situation and an issue of stigma, right?
Right.
Where we were brought up, and I will definitely say that, like, we were brought up not to say anything,
Right.
because
Same.
there was strength to be had in stoicism. And so I recall that even though my mother was my best advocate and did discover what was going on, she had to tackle the situation very quietly, or so she felt, right?
Right.
Um, and I know this, that, now, especially being in the profession that I'm in, but being able to reflect in so many different ways,
Mm.
that what she felt she was able to do was the best she could do at the
Right.
time, in her view and her perception. And certainly we were living in a time where, not, culture notwithstanding, and that society notwithstanding, that talking about these types of things, even in just general society,
Right.
was taboo, so
100%.
let alone, like, think about it. I was in elementary school when this was going on, persisting, and there were other issues that were happening in school, that, with the discrimination and
Right.
isolation as well. And I actually, side note, like, while I was going through school, because we were a multilingual home, um, I think at one point I got into a discussion where I utilized my mother tongue language to
Right.
answer a question, to like, say, okay, what is this? And the picture was of a cucumber, right?
Right.
And so I
Right.
said the Bengali word for cucumber,
Right.
and instantly, which is shasha, but
Oh.
my first grade teacher was like, "Oh, she's learning disabled." So we need to, get her assessed, and she needs to be put in a different class. And it was horrible. It was horrible. So
Oh.
again, it was another situation where,
Mm-mm.
if I were to speak up and even show any true essence of myself, I felt
Right.
like I was being put down, right?
Oh.
So my mom and my dad were my biggest advocates, and definitely so from an educational standpoint. And they fought, and they were like, "Yeah, you think she's learning disabled? Let's have her tested. Absolutely, we'll follow up with that." And then ended up in the gifted program. So, so it was, it was a very rough start to everything, but that continued.
Right.
So, to answer that question, this is a long answer to your question, but, the worldview part was, of course, very simply, I didn't ever feel like I could trust anyone.
Mm.
Um, and that speaking your truth was not something you did out loud.
Right.
You could do it in your room, you could do it in your journal if you wanted to journal, or if you could journal, like, but it was limited.
Right.
So how do you express yourself? Like, that was the question that I was left with. And I had coping tools, because what I was raised with was music and art and dance and English and literature and all things creative. And that's, my parents broke the mold there too, as Asians. They were not the traditional doctors of science or medicine,
Right.
but rather my mom is a professor of English, and my dad, who has now since passed away, was in the arts, and had his doctorate. Also, he ended up getting his doctorate in counseling as well as arts and
Wow.
education. And they kind of broke the mold when it came to those standards. So
Oh.
we were always encouraged to be expressive through our art, through our singing, through our dancing. And I had a very early start with classical forms of, Indian vocal art as well as Indian dance.
Incredible.
And that became, those became my coping mechanisms, and also my means to express myself and figure things out and process. And I really took a shine to all of it. I loved dance so much. I really trained in that quite a bit, so much so that that gave me the early starts to my yoga training. And
Ah,
that, of
okay.
course, introduced, like all of the mindfulness and, the engagement with purposefulness and breath work and just being able to sit still, you know. And it was interesting because then fast forward, I got into a relationship that was not healthy. It was abusive.
Oh
And
no.
unfortunately, I did encounter intimate partner violence. And um, again, it was interesting, despite the fact that I was going to school, and that was a different, we can talk about that,
Yeah.
like the shame that you end up feeling, the guilt and the shame that you feel afterwards, where you're like, how am I allowing myself to go through this? How did I allow myself to go
Right.
through this? Knowing what I know, you know?
Right.
Um, but aside from that, it was me again facing, is this acceptance? Is this validation? Is
Right.
this how I survive? Right? By enduring this. And so having gone through that and then coming out of it, thankfully, um, I realized really quickly that I had to build my own program for
Right.
recovery because there wasn't anything that was going to speak the same language that I spoke, or languages, I should say.
Right.
So I was so blessed again because I had mentors in academia who were just absolutely wonderful. And it was funny because who I chose to confide in, for all of the psych geeks out there with me, I had one mentor who was very, Freudian based, psychodynamic focus. And then
Mhm.
I had another one who was purely cognitive behavioral and focused on more of the humanistic approaches on that end. And it was so great to go to both of
Right.
them and to talk through
Right.
everything because I got a really diverse view, and approach to how to work through recovery from those two lenses. And it was great, it was
Right.
wonderful, it helped me, with everything that I had to process. And then I also was like, well, but there's still more because there's so many other facets to me, and that's where I dove into the yoga and the arts and the dance and the music from a therapeutic lens
Right.
at that point, and started to integrate that into my own journey.
Right. Right.
And because I had such wonderful results with it, I wanted to be able to pass that on. And this was going
Mm.
on at a time when talking about integrative care, talking about, art therapy or music therapy was considered woo woo,
Yep.
like, so, but I was like, nope, I know this works and I know this is beneficial. So I pushed it, I kept pushing it from the first job I had all the way to today, like it's definitely a passion of mine. And I will say that I'm so excited that our society, our culture, our recovery industry also is very, very, very open to
Yes.
more integrative approaches. I think what is needed more of, though, I will say in the recovery space, is true integration, where it's not just we're offering you all these things, but enhancing the communication between the actual providers to be able to provide good care, which is something that as a patient you can advocate for
Right.
more of. But yeah, so that's that's kind of the big picture view of all of the specifics with that.
I love what you said about integration. I want to hit on that, but I want to
Hmm.
quickly talk a little bit about trauma. So, all of the
Hmm.
things that
Yeah.
you've been through from,
Hmm.
abuse to racism to,
Hmm.
just
Yeah.
being a minority. There's so many things
Hmm.
to unpack
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
When we live in a state where we've been exposed to trauma and we're dealing with trauma for so long, I feel like
Hmm.
the body starts to manifest symptoms.
Yeah.
Were there symptoms that you had? And were you aware of those things? Were
Hmm.
you aware that maybe your past trauma was causing behaviors, psychosomatic, whatever it may be?
Yeah.
Walk me through
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. From a physiological standpoint, I had recurrent UTIs. And
Mm.
Nobody picked up on the fact that something could be wrong. Unfortunately, not even my provider, which I had issues with the providers too, even as a child, because I just felt like they had absolutely, there were so many that were good, but then there were others who were just zero bedside manner,
Wow.
no empathy, even to my parents who were like, why does this keep happening? Um, and of course, the tax on the kidneys, when something like that is happening, it's a very big question. So went through all the tests, and that was never fun, of course, as a child. But physiologically, that was what was going on. Um, from an, I would say, like from an emotional standpoint, again, I kind of already went over it with you, where to me it manifested as being very quiet, um,
Right.
almost probably construed as being picky or choosy, you
Huh.
know,
Right.
to other people, just
Right.
because I was keeping boundaries. And, you
Right.
know, the underlying factor there was, can I believe that I can trust you? Like, can I believe that I
Right.
can trust you? Can I actually trust you? Are
Right.
you for real, as a friend? And unfortunately, like that messaging was and has been reinforced even in the workforce. One of the other things that I've encountered, not just being a minority female, is ageism.
Mm.
I mean, when I had the blessing of being able to go to college when I was in high school. I was dual enrolled again during a time when dual enrollment didn't really exist. So I
Right.
was able to finish college a little bit earlier, and also that it afforded me time to do more specialties and dive
Amazing.
into things that I wanted to do. So because of that, like I was younger coming into the
Ah, okay.
professional field. And that was something that was like, people would look at my resume and be like, that's not real. This isn't
Oh
this
no.
isn't real. And I'm like,
I've been there. I've been there.
okay,
Yeah.
you can think it's not real, but it's real.
Right.
So I've encountered that. I've encountered um being in situations where, yeah, despite being the expert in the field, you're just not going to be heard because of whatever stigmas surround mental health and
Yes.
wellness. You
Yes.
know, on top of that, you're a female minority singing this song, so there's been a lot of struggle with that I've encountered. And I unfortunately, I will say that happened quite a bit in the military setting, where things were very, cut and dry for so many people, black and white for a lot of people, um, because unfortunately, and again, that's the culture, is it's return to duty, return to duty, return to duty. And
Right. Right.
the poor psych department, and anybody who's in wellness or trying to, help from a mental health standpoint is going to be met with some amount of resistance, because the goal is, no, just get back to duty.
Right.
So a lot of struggles that I faced there, as a result. But a lot of beautiful souls that I met who don't sing that song and who want to promote and advocate for, mental health and wellness, in those types of settings. So yeah, I mean, the trauma in the lexicon of trauma, I
Right.
would say, that ends up formulating, especially whenever in your timeline, but for me, it formulated in childhood. And unfortunately, I didn't get a break from it. Like the lexicon was reinforced consistently and in
Right.
different ways throughout my timeline.
Right.
And unfortunately, I will fully admit that for me personally, that has created, like I mentioned, those trust issues
Right.
that have, forced me to reinforce boundary setting and questioning, even, that is the positive possible? Is somebody being genuine real? Can a work environment actually be supportive and healing and genuine and authentic? And,
Mm.
like, of course, even when you're on that recovery journey and you've done the work to be able to answer those questions and formulate your own ability to say, I'm going to operate from, the positive, your brain is already naturally wired to
Right.
go back and say, no, 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 protect yourself.
Exactly.
you know think of the negative, because that's how you protect yourself, right?
Right.
So we're already shaped to do that, but
Right.
then when you add this lexicon of trauma over it and lace it on top, right, now you're heightening it even more. So it's a daily thing that you have to work on, and but that's okay.
Right.
That doesn't mean that you're not on a recovery journey. That doesn't mean that you're not healing. That actually does mean that you're healing, because you're stopping and you're thinking about it. You're saying, wait a second, I'm recognizing what's happening. Or, you know what, this is getting too hard and I need help. And
Right.
that's okay. Right.
Right.
So I had to learn in my own way that asking for help was safe and was okay.
Mm.
And despite what I experienced, and also I saw other family members go through their own traumas as well, and go through that whole thing where if I asked for help, then that was not good, and
Right.
being stigmatized for it. I saw that happening in front of me. So like I had to navigate through that, and again go back to that place of choice and say, well, that sucked, you know, and I never want to be that. And I never want to encourage an environment where that's the case. So here I go singing my song.
Right. Right.
Um, so yeah, so it definitely affected worldview. It definitely, impacts, I would say, how I process things.
Right.
But again, that's okay. That's part of it. That's the healing journey.
Right, right,
Yeah.
absolutely. And you've done so much work to
Mhm.
become who you are today and to go
Mhm.
on a healing journey that has been rich and robust. Walk me through. You talked a little bit about music. You talked a little bit about yoga and some of the things that
Yeah.
you have done. What were, if you were to pick three things that you feel like were integral to your healing journey, what were those three things and why?
Yeah. Oh, great. So yeah, I would say music, dance, and art were
Okay. Okay.
definitely integral to my healing. Um, and when I say dance, that includes yoga, because the yoga training was part of my dance training.
Okay.
Um, but all three of those connected to me and gave me education at an academic level, at a spiritual level, at an emotional level.
Wow.
And every single time, so my family was amazing. My mom sang. She was my first teacher. My dad played percussion to accompany us. My sister sang and also played percussion. So we were a family that did this together. Okay. And that also served as that sense of family connection for me. So our unit
Mm.
was reinforced through these things. Um, so when I would sit down to sing, or when I would stand up to dance, I truly felt not only like I was in a state of flow, but that I was connected to something higher than myself. And it was just a different world altogether. Um,
Mm.
and being able to do that, first and
Right.
foremost, was an
Right.
escape, but at the same time it was also a way for me to express safely. So those three elements represented safety to me as well. Um, so yeah, I would say those three were the best. And then if you gave me a fourth, I would say the world of academia for
Right.
sure. Like
Right.
I dove into school, head first. And my family was a family of academicians, and they were all my mom and dad were both professors. Like, it was kind of gonna happen in
Right.
some way, shape,
Right.
or and my earliest memories were of being with my mom, while she was teaching at university, at college, and running around the library stacks and feeling, smelling the beautiful smell of a library,
Me too.
and
Me
yeah, yeah,
too. My dad's a
like just
professor. I went to his classes
yeah,
went from the time I was
yes,
in the, what do you call
the
it? The
little
little carrier.
barrier. Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's something to be said about that. And like I grew up just looking at my mom and my dad teaching at the front of the room and
Yeah.
thinking to myself, like I want that. They're helping heal and continue something on in their own way. And I want to do that too in
Yeah.
my way. Was like the message that was there for me as a child for sure. So
Wow.
um, yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I think back that seeing your parents and seeing them do what they do best is just,
Hmm.
as a child, I feel like that's such an important experience. And I love that
Yeah,
we share that. I
yeah,
remember going to my
I
dad's
know.
classes, and it
Yeah, that's so great.
was
Yeah.
such an important experience. You know,
Yeah.
all the things you've been through, how has it shaped your work today? I know that, your outlook, how you, approach the individuals that you work with is so unique. So walk me through your approach and, what from your past have you, taken and, shifted, created
Yeah.
protocols and programs around in order
Yeah.
to work with people, at a really soul level?
Yeah. So, I mean, like I mentioned, I was raised in a home where that Eastern philosophy wasn't a theory. It was literally the rhythm of
Right,
life.
right,
And we lived it, and there was reverence for the unseen, for elders, for ritual, for stillness, for storytelling, for prayer, for acts of service that were not considered tools in the industry, when I was coming into the mental health field. Um, so I obviously like developed that appreciation for it, and then I wanted to marry it with scientific rigor. So I started to, when I was practicing like fresh out of school, I was working. One of my first roles was as the head provider psychologist for an adolescent TBI facility. And I was working with individuals anywhere between the ages of, infancy all the way up to the 30s, their 30s,
right.
because with TBI, age of onset with the TBI is where individuals have the tendency to regress to. So the adolescent program was really wide spanning.
And
Um,
sorry, what's TBI, just to make sure?
yeah, yeah, traumatic brain injury. So
Got it. Yeah.
yeah, any type of traumatic brain injury. So so yeah, so when I was there, like I was, I was like, why aren't we integrating these things? Like this is what I want us to
Mm,
do. This is, I think we can do this. Let's try it. And there was so much resistance with it, which was unfortunate. But um I pushed, I pushed. We saw results. It was great. I still was met with more resistance and, again, politics, and decided to move forward from there and, pursue the same passion in another facility, and just kept building on it, right?
right.
um the interesting thing was that with each environment that I was in, right, I started to build the programs and I started to integrate these different facets. So it was like, how can we get recreational therapy and occupational therapy to maybe look at these other angles? Is there an art therapy? Is there what we now call adventure therapy, right? How can
Mm,
we integrate that in? And then I was building programs doing this, right? And I just
right.
loved it, right? And I also
Amazing.
saw in building these programs that I was taking myself outside of just the one-on-one, right? One-on-one was great, being able to provide services, doing talk therapy and what have you. It was wonderful and I love it and it's impactful. But when I program developed, I was hitting the masses, right? I was able to positively impact more than just one person at a time. And that very quickly then became a passion of mine. And that's what formulated that mission statement that has driven me through my career, which is I definitely want to help the person who's sitting in front of me or standing in front of me but I also want to be able to impact positively as many people as I possibly can.
Right.
And that's actually what took me to working with the military, because I was like, ooh, you know, like I already have a passion for this community and,
Right.
want to give back. But what a great opportunity to be able to give back to a wide population, and a big population. So that then really enhanced my programmatic development skills, and I just carried that forward. And today, long story short, there's a lot of other things that happened in between, but today I have my own practice, which is the Synergy Center, where I really do more of the directorial and, kind of like management of everything. Our director of wellness is actually my husband. His name is
Oh,
Christian
cool.
Malgeri. Yeah. So he, leads that charge primarily now, but I work for a company outside of that now. And the company is recovery.com. And recovery.com, part of our mission is to be able to connect people to care, to remove the barriers that an individual might face as they're engaging in their own journey, and or a family member who might be feeling lost and trying to figure out how to connect their loved ones to actual care that's going to help them. That's the mission at recovery.com. And what I do there as the chief clinical officer is really spearhead the concept of recovery literacy.
Mm,
And what does that mean? That means not only do we want to give you the education that you need to be able to go through your own journey or help someone go through their journey, but we want to be able to show you that there is hope. There is recovery. Recovery is, of course, what we want.
right.
Recovery is possible. Recovery doesn't have to feel inaccessible. And here's all the information related to that. So, I'm spearheading a lot, in that effort of trying to get recovery literacy to be seen, to be accessible, and to help with people making that connection to treatment so that they can get the help that they need.
Incredible, incredible. I want to ask this because you talked a little bit about the Eastern influence and the Western academia that you went route that you went through.
Hmm.
What is one thing that you think that Western psychology or kind of the academic world and
Yeah.
Western cultures misses that you feel like Eastern philosophy does better?
Yeah. Well, the beautiful thing is that, Western philosophy is all movement based, right? It's goal setting, it's planning, it's how are we achieving these goals? That's where are we at after a certain amount of time. Whereas, just generally speaking, Eastern philosophy says stillness can be part of that journey. That,
Mm,
that stillness and peace
right,
and mindfulness and purposefulness, however slow or fast we take that, that path or walk that path, is healing in and of itself. So
right,
there's this element in Eastern philosophy, in my view, with that just general breakdown, where the two can be married, right?
right,
And
right,
again,
right.
depending on where you're at on your in your journey, maybe stillness is the place you need to start, or maybe it's stillness that has to happen in the middle, or maybe it's stillness that has to happen throughout. Whatever, like you get to define it, right? So when you put the two together, you're essentially giving yourself the best of both worlds, and being more flexible with your recovery journey. Whereas being in one side or the other may feel a little constrictive, right?
Right.
So I really feel like it's a way to be able to discover and embrace the flow that is only going to be defined by you
Right, right, right.
when you utilize these two philosophies. Yeah.
Mm. And, I heard you say the word healing timeline.
Hmm.
What's your take on healing timeline? Explain that for our audience. Is that helpful, or is it? Walk us
Yeah.
through that.
Okay. So the real answer is that there is no timeline,
Mm.
that it is ongoing. And for me, the infinity symbol means a lot. In my family, my family now,
Right.
we always say infinity with love. We love you, infinity, right? Like that's what
Oh,
we always
that's
say to one
beautiful.
another. Yeah. So so that's what
I
we
love that.
say. But when it comes to this topic, right? Infinity to me means being able to embrace the fact that you are going to be on this journey, and that that's okay, and that's needed, and that in so doing, in being, in embracing this infinity, you are giving yourself and giving the world, if you choose, the ability to be part of that infinite journey with you.
Right,
And you can
right.
spread that wealth.
Mm,
And there's so much that goes to that. It's being able to talk about it, and normalizing the conversation. That
right,
has to happen with infinity.
right,
Like
right,
we
right,
need to like be able to start talking about this, and not just stop after we've started. We need to keep it going.
right,
um, we need to be able to understand that it's not, I go through a treatment program and then I'm done,
right,
or I go through 8 sessions of therapy and now I'm done, right? Even if you're choosing not to be in therapy or counseling or coaching or whatever, what are you doing to maintain? So, maintenance is part of that infinite journey. And I say infinity or infinite not to be daunting, but again, to normalize the fact that who we are today and what we've gone through, to include, you know, the things that we've learned as part of our healing journey, needs to continue, right?
right.
And we're not going to be who we were 5 seconds ago, just from a biological standpoint. Like who I was when I walked in the door versus who I'm going to be when I leave this room isn't going to be the same person from a biological standpoint. So, how can we expect ourselves to be the same, having gone through the experiences that we've gone through, and, think that it's just going to be, this stagnant line,
Right, right,
right?
right,
So yeah, I like saying infinity, infinite, because to the whole timeline situation, because
right,
it is ongoing, not to
right,
be daunting, but it is ongoing. It's something that I encourage everyone to embrace. And it's something that can be not only a platform, but, a beautiful, almost, I want to say companion, but not really, but just like part of who you are,
right,
and part of who you are without defining you, but
right,
rather enhancing you,
right.
you know?
I love, so beautifully put. So beautifully put.
Thank you. Thank you.
I know in your work you also work a lot with families and children, and I feel like sometimes you often see intergenerational patterns. Walk me
Hmm.
through how that shows up in your practice, and how can someone recognize that, hey, this is actually coming from generations in my family, and what can they do to break that?
Ugh. Cycle breaking.
Yes.
Hashtag cycle breaking.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much that gets passed down without us even recognizing it, like
Yes.
intentionally, right? It's, again, from a very simple point of view, you know, whatever you end up seeing, and just consuming, because we talked about that earlier, like being able to grow up and see our parents teach and run through the library stacks, like that's part of it. That's a
Right.
positive part of it. But even the way our parents or our grandparents have coped with things has been passed down, right? And
So true.
like, again, whether we wanted that or not, like
Right.
we're seeing it, right?
Right. Right. Right.
So then, like the other component that I'm going to include here is historical issues. Like a lot of our parents, I know mine certainly did, went through significant historical trauma that influenced their ability to be able to cope, their stress management tools, excuse me, their perception of the world and
Same.
worldview. And as a result of that, that's not only what emphasized so many of the kind of like boundaries and limitations that they believed equated to survival, right?
Yes.
So we see this even, like just as an example, like generations who went through the Great Depression, who have, for example, a tendency to really have a scarcity mindset and kind of
Yes.
operate from that standpoint, right? And then how that gets passed down, maybe now I'm really super tight with budget, because that was passed down as a survival skill, so these are things that you might not have recognized, but they're real and they're there, right? So from an intergenerational situation, it's like what for me, for my family, it was like, okay, what did my mom and dad endure, and feel like they
Mm,
had to endure from their own familial nucleus, from society at large when they were growing up, and even as they came over here to the United States, um, and what did they feel like they needed to configure to survive in this new
yes.
environment? All were factors that played into how they coped with things, how they processed things, the kind of like family mottos that got passed
Oh,
down,
yes.
you know, um, and of course had an impact on me. Again, that's why I always tended to be like, well, where am I gonna speak my truth? Where does that happen? Right. And my mom's answer to that at the time would have been with me. She would say, if you
Wow.
want to talk to me if you want to talk to somebody, right? And so yeah, so intergenerationally, there's a lot that gets passed down. How do you end up being a cycle breaker? Well, the first thing is you've got to start recognizing the parts where you hear yourself or you see yourself mirroring traditions that maybe aren't right, to follow through with.
Yeah.
Because, and the biggest one that I'm gonna the harp on right now is that sense of silence and stoicism being equated to strength, because that is what has reinforced stigma,
Totally.
right?
I see that all the time. I want to ask a challenge though, because I see that all the time. Like there's this, and I'm
Hmm.
going to be very blunt here. Like especially as a black woman, I see it in the black
Hmm.
community all the time. It's, you need to shoulder the
Yeah.
burden, and when you start to talk about it, I often see people getting shamed,
Yep.
and their family being like, "Hey, you're being too
Yeah.
woo woo. You're being too emotional. Like, we
Hmm.
all went through this, so just shut up and deal with it."
Yes. Yeah.
What do you say when that's happening? Like, how does someone reconcile with that? They're trying to do the work, they're trying to come out and be a cycle breaker, and their community is telling them, you need to shut up. Like, that's enough from you, and
Hmm.
you need to, we've
Hmm.
all been through this.
I'm gonna be blunt with you.
I love it. I love bluntness.
And I'm gonna say you don't need to be in that community. Like,
Mm.
so here's the thing. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I felt the same.
Right.
I saw, again, like I mentioned to you, I saw a family member go through a trauma that, that individual needed support, didn't understand, where to get it, how to get it, that kind of a thing. It came out in the community, and the community was not supportive at all. And I saw that, as a child for sure. But then coming out, like, okay, there's a child's perception. And of course, as a child's perception was like, well, I thought the community was supposed to support you. Wait, to survive, I've got to survive my community? How does that make sense? Like,
Right.
shouldn't
Right.
my community be supportive and loving and embracing? And where did the whole it takes a village, concept
Exactly.
go?
Right.
Like,
The village rolled
so
out, and then they're like,
yeah.
shame, shame.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and there is, I'm sure in every culture and community we can, and I know this scientifically, like we definitely see that. But we
Right.
can also see the flip side. There are communities and cultures that will be embracing. So to answer your question, what do you do when that shaming occurs? I'm going to say you keep singing your song louder,
Mm,
okay? Because here's the other thing. If a community feels the need to stifle and shame or silence, that is coming from a place of fear. So then you've got to ask, why does that community live in fear about confronting whatever the issue is? Okay. That's the root. So then when we answer that question of the why, now you can start targeting advocacy and support for the why, and
Exactly.
there will be resistance. So here's what I will say, aside from my other, joke of, well, kind of joke of like, if it's not supporting you, then leave. But the other part of this is, in helping the community, you will be the person who sings that song.
Right, 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 right,
And
right.
sometimes it might not be in that same community, but for that population at large.
Mm,
Okay. And so I will say this, where I didn't feel accepted or supported or see that be done when I was growing up within my own community, I made the choice to start to back away from it, because I wanted to find my own community. I wanted to be, linked with other people, and, be with individuals who would be supportive. And I found that with other people who were not necessarily Southeast Asian, but were from a very diverse set of backgrounds. I loved it. I mean, my Latin American family back at U of M, like, I was in love. They embrace me like nobody's business. You
how
know what I mean?
beautiful. That's
So yeah,
amazing.
so it's like sometimes you'll find that sense of community in other communities.
Right.
Further that, in with my fellow Southeast Asian individuals, I have found people globally now who understand the need to be able to sing that song louder and from the top of the highest mountain to be able to break those stigmas. And what I've been inspired by is seeing that happen more, which is really great. So you can find your own community within your community, but maybe not in your immediate
Right.
location.
Right. Right.
Maybe it's going to be, in other ways, shapes, or forms. But I will say this, going back to that flip side, kind of like the devil's advocate point of view, is that if a society or community is afraid, is guilting and shaming, there's usually some kind of fear that is linked with it. That fear is a want for survival. It's also something that is representative of something that's they're passionate about, or maybe have encountered, heard about themselves. So take a moment to say, wait a second, what is it that everyone's actually afraid of? And how can
Mm,
I be an agent for change, for evolution, for that element, to eradicate that whole fear factor.
right. Right. I love how you said, what is everyone afraid of? I feel like if we pause more often and ask that
Hmm.
question, I
Hmm.
think about even too giving my family, my parents, I feel like I always say,
Hmm.
I've been so grateful to have such a wonderful family, wonderful parents, and they're not perfect too. And I think that when you put yourselves in their shoes and say, okay, what are they afraid of?
Hmm.
What are the trauma? What are the things that they're coming to the table with, and how is that impacting how they're reacting to some of the things I'm
Yeah.
doing?
Yeah.
And just
100%.
reframing that in your mind,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
using that as a basis to move forward is so powerful, so
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah.
If someone is on a healing journey, trauma, whatever it may be, generational issues, what are some healing exercises that they could practice on their own without guidance? What are some resources that you would recommend?
Yeah. To navigate intergenerational trauma, is that what you're asking
To
about in
navigate,
terms of?
it's even more macro. Just let's say someone, no matter what has happened to someone in their past, other
Yeah.
things or their practices or their resources you would advise people to seek out.
Mm. Well, I always like to say being able to reinforce the connection with yourself is always going to be where you want to come back to.
Right.
So, whatever that is for you, whether it's meditating, whether it's engaging in art, you don't have to be an artist, by the way. There's something cathartic with being able to take a paintbrush and just make your strokes, on that blank canvas that's really truly empowering.
I agree.
Um, listening to music, engaging in creating music, sitting down and writing and saying, all I have to do is write one line. I'm not putting any pressure on myself about anything. That's my journal. It doesn't, whatever speaks to you that helps reinforce your connection with yourself is where I always recommend people to start.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. I love that.
Hmm.
Just getting back to you and your
Hmm.
voice, not ignoring that voice is just so,
Yeah.
so important. I want to
Yeah.
do this. I want to transition to
Yeah.
true or false, a segment I
Yeah.
absolutely love. We're going to go through a whole bunch of different questions and would love for you to tell us, are these statements true or are they false? So
Yeah.
the first one is everyone should be in therapy.
You want the Mala answer?
Yes, yes, give us the Mala answer.
The Mala answer is yes, true, 100%. You know why? Because here's the misconception. People think therapy, counseling, coaching, peer support, whatever, has to happen only when something is wrong.
Agree, totally.
That is false. That's what's false. And this is something that I've even taught to my students, in school and academia is like, remember that therapy isn't just about, talking about and problem solving the stuff that's not going well. It's about celebrating the wins and being able to use that as a platform for continued growth and evolution.
Right,
So,
right.
if you have the mindset of, I want to continue to grow and I want to continue to evolve, why don't we all afford ourselves the ability to have somebody who's like that? And again,
Mm,
it doesn't have to be therapy, it can be therapy, coaching, peer support, mentoring, whatever, that supportive ancillary, function in your
right.
life, I think everyone should have.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that reframe on therapy. I think a lot of times people see therapy as like the crisis line. Like I only go
Mhm.
when I'm in deep,
Yeah.
deep trouble. But
Yeah. Yeah.
you can have positive win-win enriching conversations
Hmm.
that are proactive
Hmm.
as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
The next one, you can heal trauma without ever talking about it.
Ooh. Mm. I'm going to say false to that one too. Um, but there's an element that's true as well.
Unpack that.
Yeah, I'm going to unpack that for you. So, where it's true is trauma can definitely be worked on silently and
Okay.
in silence and in stillness, like I mentioned. But, so that's where it's true, you know, but talking about it is cathartic. And even, I'm going to say this, even if you're talking about it with yourself first,
Mm,
okay?
right, right, right.
Because one of the hardest things can be facing yourself, whether it's looking at yourself in the mirror, sitting with yourself silently alone in your room and saying, I just endured abuse.
Yeah. Mm,
I am a survivor of intimate partner violence.
right.
That just happened. That can be one of the most challenging things to do because when you admit it to yourself, not only does it make it real, but you're also left with, how am I going to get through this?
Right.
Right? Just
Right.
kind of that, like, oh my gosh,
Right.
um, and that's okay because it's just a starting point, right? So, can it be healed without talking about it? There are ways to work on it without talking about it. But do I recommend that? No, because I think we should be integrative and I think we should start talking about it. We have to talk about it. We need to talk about it first and foremost with ourselves and then with a professional that can help you with unpacking it objectively and, supportively.
I got chills when you said, just looking at yourself in the mirror and admitting what has happened to you.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
It's just it can be really earth shattering exercise
Hmm.
to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
The next one, PTSD is only caused by extreme events like war or abuse.
Nope. False. Yeah.
Unpack
No.
that quickly. I'm
Yeah.
curious.
So if let me just put it to you this way. Trauma can be experienced by watching somebody go through something as well. So, there's definitely, like, for example, just as an example, if you witness somebody dying,
Right.
okay, that can be a traumatic event. If you repeatedly see somebody encounter atrocities, if you repeatedly end up going through or have experienced, not even repeatedly, a natural disaster of some kind, all of these can create responses that are prolonged. Now, how they're diagnosed in the DSM is different. There's varying diagnoses for these types of things, but the actual reaction that's prolonged and chronic that then creates secondary reactions that we may not be aware of, or anxieties that we don't get where they're coming from, can be related to these things that may not be classified as only war or abuse.
Thanks for unpacking that.
Yeah.
The next one, some people are not built for therapy.
um hmm. Some people are not built for therapy, just not built for therapy. I think that's false, because I think everybody has a path that they can take in therapy or in some type of supportive service, provider-based service. So I would say, even if you think you're the most rigid person and you think you're not built for it, that's actually a sign that you are.
I know
So
some people. I'm like, some people, I'm looking at you. I know some
yeah.
people who will swear up and down they're not built for therapy. It will never work for them. Blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah. Yes. So Dr. Mala just.
There's one thing that we say, especially when it comes to like relationship therapy or even business-based therapy, like business psychology, if there's a partnership that you're trying to work through or whatever. Anyway, relationships, right? There's always one person who gets dragged in, and
Yes.
then there's the other one who's like all gusto and like, we're doing this kind of thing. And of course, there are situations where both are amenable, but it's usually the one who's getting dragged in who's going to end up loving therapy the most, even though that they were resistant to it, and they're going to adhere to what's said better. I've seen this a
Oh, how
lot in a
interesting.
lot of
How
cases. It's
interesting.
really,
I'm
yeah,
thinking about some people in my life who are so resistant to the idea of therapy. I am legit sending them this clip. So if you get this clip
yeah.
anonymously from me, with the
Thank
two
you.
eyes emoji,
I love it. I love that.
you know what's
That's
up.
awesome. Yeah.
The next one, meditation can rewire the brain just like therapy. Is that true or false?
Oh, true. Yeah, 100%. Meditation is so powerful. Oh my gosh, it's so powerful.
It is.
Um, even just taking a minute, to reset your breath and be mindful, the most basic practices of
Right.
meditation helps with altering your neurochemistry to help you, calm down and recenter yourself. So if you take that and multiply it by whatever number, that you can manage, it is helping you at a biological neurochemical level, right? So,
Right.
does it help with rewiring? Absolutely. If you then take meditative practices and use that in conjunction with reframing and the tools that you're learning therapeutically, that's even better, right? But is it its own form of therapy? I 100% believe it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Another one, self care is being overused as a therapy substitute.
Ooh. Huh. Um, I don't know if I can generally say that that's true because I don't have statistics, but I think there are a lot of people who think, oh, if I engage in self-care, that's just as good.
Right.
So I do think that there is a misconception. And usually that misconception is because they're trying to avoid going to see somebody for some reason. Because why? There's a fear, right? And usually the fear is, what am I going to unpack? So, where I would say, like self-care is being overused, it's being overused by that population of people who are avoiding therapy and maybe are resistant to it because they're afraid of what they're going to unpack. And then that's where it's like, oh, well, I went to go get a manicure. Why am I not feeling better
Right.
with my anxiety kind of thing, keeps coming up. And we all know the answer to that. And that is because getting a manicure isn't going to help you with your anxiety.
No, it's not. As cute as
Yeah.
nail X nails are, it's just it's
Yeah.
it's not the cure all for anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And to that too, like how we're defining self-care, I think is
Right.
really important.
Agreed. I was gonna say that.
I think the definition has been unfortunately diminished a bit. To which I would say, like self-care from that healing perspective needs to be defined separately from self-care that we're utilizing to help just maintain our sense of self and
Right.
in how we feel and things like that from kind of a surface level, right? Like the manicures and the pedicures and
Right.
massages and stuff.
Right.
Not that that can't be healing, but it's
Exactly.
not it.
It's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
the only
Yeah.
thing.
Not the be all end all. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. I want to ask one last one. Love
Mhm.
isn't enough to keep a relationship healthy.
Yeah, the true. Yeah, love isn't enough to keep
Mm.
a relationship healthy. Um, but I will also say, I love that I have a little asterisk by every single one that you're asking me here. Um, I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah, it isn't enough to keep a relationship healthy because we need a lot of other things that go beyond love, but are definitely related. It leads back to love, um, and that is partnership. Like
Right.
what does partnership and how you define partnership look like? And that, when I say that, I mean that beyond love. You can love somebody and have an absolutely horrible partnership that is completely imbalanced and not reciprocal, and because of that, be toxic to you and everyone involved.
So true.
So that, from that standpoint, it's not enough to keep a relationship healthy. But can it be a foundation? Here's the asterisk. Can it be a foundation? Absolutely, it can be a
Right.
foundation for a relationship to thrive, but you can't just use that, in my opinion.
Right.
You can't just rely on that because you can end up in toxic situations
Mm.
if you do. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to move on to our next section, which is our rapid
Yeah.
fire section. So we have a bunch of trending questions that we want to ask you, and looking for some short answers to these trending questions that everyone has been wondering about. So um, let's start with this one. What is one daily practice you recommend to patients dealing with unresolved grief?
Mm, yeah. Commemorate them somehow. For example, light a candle, say their name, and
Mm,
then breathe for them.
mm, beautiful. Wow, wow, wow,
Mhm.
wow.
Yeah.
What is one therapy cliche that you secretly love?
Um, feel it to heal it.
Unpack that.
Yeah. So it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, like when you feel something and you give yourself the space to admit that you're feeling it, that's what's, a lot of times the starting point for your recovery journey,
Yes.
So if you allow yourself to feel, if you allow yourself to connect with yourself, then you're starting your healing journey and
Mm,
you're making recovery a reality.
mm, amazing. Another one. What is
Mhm.
one grounding tool that always works?
Oh, that's a good one. There's so many. That's why my head just
I
went like,
know,
"Wait,
I
all of
know.
them."
You get one. We're throwing the challenge at you.
I know. Yeah, you're like, okay. 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can smell,
Ah,
2 things that you can sense around you here,
right.
1 thing that you can sense under your feet, whatever your 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is, that's really good. And I don't like conforming people to a prescribed set of senses, whatever they want to focus on or need to focus on more of now is what I want you to lead with. So if it's five things that you can hear instead of see, then go with that because maybe you need to close your eyes right now. So connecting to your senses and, taking yourself down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1,
Right.
and, being able to just, ground yourself that way is always a good tool.
I love
Yeah.
that. I love that. That's a good. That's a
Mhm.
good one that I feel like, yeah, anyone can use.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Let me ask you this: what is your favorite question to ask a client?
Ah, oh, there's two.
Okay. Okay. I'm giving you
Yeah,
the
yeah, there's
two.
two. Okay. What are you afraid would happen if you allowed yourself to let this go?
Ooh, that's a juicy one. Ooh,
That one.
yeah.
And then my other favorite one is what we call the miracle question.
Okay.
If all of your problems or the main problem that you're talking about right now was to go away miraculously,
Right.
what would your life look like right now?
Ooh. Ooh, that's a, do you ever get people who are resistant when you ask? I feel like sometimes we can be, the issues at hand can be so great that it's hard to see beyond. Um,
Oh, yeah.
do you get
Yeah.
people who are like pushing back on you when you ask those two questions?
Yeah. I mean, like people have come back and said things like, well, that's not even a possibility.
Wow.
So I don't know why
Wow.
you're asking that question.
Wow. 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 Yeah,
And
that,
then I'll say, yeah, and then I usually will take them down some type of a path to say, bear with me for a second. No
mm,
bars held,
right.
like
Right.
let's just paint on a blank canvas. What does it look like for you? And
Right.
sometimes again, I've taught this one too, to students where when you find that resistance, you may have to think about asking yourself that question or the person that you're working with for all the providers out there
Right.
ask that question from a different view, so switch it into a lexicon that they're going to understand. If they're a programmer, use
Right.
programming language. If they're
Right.
an artist, use the blank canvas, perspective, because that ties into their mode of expressing themselves.
Wow. Boy, I'm
Mhm.
gonna have to use that because I think that
Mhm.
sometimes I think about challenging myself, I'll get stuck in story and or the issues at
Yeah.
hand, and I love that because it takes you out of that and allows you to kind of
Hmm.
recreate
Hmm.
and reimagine what could be next.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me ask you this one. This is selfishly my rapid fire question.
I like it. Yeah.
What is the emotion that people avoid the most?
That's a good one. Oh, there's so many. So so I think general discomfort, anything that feels uncomfortable is what people want to avoid. But I would say shame, because shame also means you're not getting validated again by yourself. Um, you're not accepted, you're isolated, but then some people will shame themselves, right?
Yes.
Which is
Yes.
also why I said general discomfort, because anything that doesn't feel comfortable, even in some cases, joy is what people might have a tendency to avoid.
Wow. So, so true. And I feel like there's a paradigm I've noticed in certain groups or circles where
Hmm.
if you are too joyful,
Hmm.
people are like, what's wrong with you? And there can
You up with
be
that
a,
person?
yeah, exactly. They're like, I'm forgetting the term. I've heard this term before where people, kind of almost, well, I have this issue. Well, I have this issue where like people almost
It's
bond
a
over that.
competition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's
Hmm.
like people I was talking to a friend about this and they were like, I'm actually like really thriving. I'm doing great in my life and almost embarrassed. I feel ashamed to share that. And I was like,
Hmm.
what a pity. They're like, I just feel like people are going
Yeah.
to judge me.
Yeah.
And ridicule me because I know so many people that are going through so much.
Yeah.
Anyway, let me ask you this. What's your go-to way to decompress?
Oh, um, meditation.
Yeah,
That's a non-negotiable for me.
me too.
Yeah, meditation is my non-negotiable. And I will say, which is a meditative practice, although not what I consider my meditative practice, is my facial routine. Because I take the time to
Right.
be very purposeful with gua sha and
Okay.
lymphatic drainage.
I love
And
this.
it just, every single time, especially if I'm going through something that's high stress, I kid you not, I will feel the knots in
Yes.
my jaws and in my face. And so, it's part of my daily routine now to engage in gua sha with mindfulness, with breathing, and just being in a kind of meditative state. Although, like I said, it's not my meditation practice. So meditation and definitely my routine.
I love
Yeah,
that. Me too.
yeah,
Me too. I
yeah,
love the facial. I think for some people are like, that we were talking about self-care. People are like, oh, well, let's
yeah,
just, but no, I think that there's a way to do it that really is grounding and
yeah,
healing. And I'm with
yeah.
you. I do the same thing.
Yeah. I love it.
Let me ask this. I'm going to ask you two more. What is the
Mhm.
most overrated concept in modern wellness?
Oh, ooh, that's a good one. Um, Toxic positivity.
Mm, please unpack that because I've heard this everywhere. I heard people, I went down a rabbit hole last night actually on toxic positivity because
Yeah.
everyone's been complaining about ChatGPT being, just and how the answers are starting to lean on the edge of toxic positivity. So anyway, I feel like there's a lot of controversy and energy around that term. So yes, unpack.
Can positivity be toxic? Yes, if it's fake.
Right, 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 right,
You know?
right.
And I think that's why, like, to that end, I love that you brought up Chat GPT
Yes,
because everyone is like now um doing the roasts,
yes, yes.
which I found really interesting because, like, oh, how did such a, Chat GPT roast my partner or me or whatever? Because they're feeling that it's too positive, too hopeful, too dewy, like, and it's that
Exactly.
positivity is just like too much, right? And
Right.
it's not realistic. And I think some of that also, unfortunately, is because of what we're going through as a world right now.
Oh,
Um, and that's sad. So so I have so much I could say about this, but to stay succinct, I will say that if positivity is fake, that's when I believe it is toxic.
mm,
If
mm,
positivity is flooding our chat GPT and it's bothering you, I want you to ask yourself why and why it feels like it's too much. And then let's start to unpack that, right?
mm.
And unpack it to a point of like, well, to me, most immediately, I would say it's probably showing you what you want more of for real.
I agree. I agree. I'm so glad that
Yeah.
and I don't want to like, I could go into a whole rabbit hole, but
Yeah.
literally, this was me last night going
Yeah.
down a rabbit hole on Reddit on what people are saying
Yeah.
about chat. And I was like, I agree. I was like, this is so sad. Like
Yeah.
people want to, like chat
Yeah.
GPT to almost verbally abuse them. And they feel more comfortable with that. I
Yeah.
do believe that there should be succinctness, there should be accuracy, of course. And,
Yeah.
but
For sure.
I just felt like some people were like, yeah, it's telling me I'm doing a good job, and I don't believe that. And I'm like, wait, there's a whole lot that we need to unpack about
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
I love it. Yeah. Yeah.
I digress. Let me ask you this. What is a book that you recommend to everyone?
Oh, that's not a fair one.
I know, asking an academic to
I
recommend
know.
one book.
Oh, come on. Yeah. All right. Okay. So I love The Body Keeps Score.
Yeah,
It is
amazing.
just amazing. It's great. So if I had to recommend something, it would be that. And you're making me choose one. Um,
Exactly.
I have a lot of other books that I like. So if you want, hit me up for that list.
Yes, and we're gonna get that list after. So that's the fun thing about rapid fire. It's like the constraint. It's like, And I totally lied. I want to ask you just one more. What is one piece of advice that you give to yourself often?
Uh, oh, that's a good one. You're allowed to take up space and rest in it.
Mm, I love that. I love it. That's something I'm working on, to be honest.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's definitely a work in progress, for sure. Because, like I mentioned to you before, part of my healing was like diving into academia and work, and that can become dangerous
Right.
too.
Exactly.
So being able to give yourself permission to rest and be in space, like take up space to
Yes.
rest
Yes.
is important. Yeah,
Totally. Totally,
yeah,
totally, totally. I
yeah,
love that you said that.
yeah.
Such divine timing you said that. It's so funny, like random tangent before we move on to the next section.
Mhm.
That actually came up this morning. Long story short, I'm learning French and I just turned 40.
Ooh,
And, one of the things my French teacher asked me about was to write in French about what I want to do differently in my 40s.
I love
And
it.
this morning, that was exactly it. It
Oh.
was to learn how to rest without feeling guilty and to take
Okay,
up.
but now you
Yeah.
have to say it in French.
No, I'm so embarrassed. I will.
Oh, I love it. That's so
Yeah,
awesome.
it was so funny. We're learning words like about rest and
Yeah,
about gratitude and that was our
yeah,
lesson this morning. Anyway, I digress.
that's
I'm not going to
awesome.
butcher it
I
anyway.
love
My
it.
pronunciation is horrible in French, so I don't want to embarrass myself.
Oh, it's
But
okay. No
I just felt
pressure.
like that was divine timing that you just said that.
That's
Anyway,
beautiful. That's beautiful.
oh, it's so funny. I want to move on to our next section, which is breaking wild trends down. There are some wild, wild trends on social media, on TikTok, on
Yeah.
Instagram, on all the things.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
would just love for you to unpack some of these things that we're finding and seeing. So
Yeah.
I want to ask you this. Is reparenting yourself a valid therapeutic tool or is it pop psychology?
Mm. Reparenting can be a really profoundly healing process,
Right.
but when it's done with care. What
Mm,
does that mean? It means you're offering yourself a sense of nurturing, you're you're reinforcing a sense of protection for
right.
yourself,
Right.
validation that might have been missing early in life. But what you want to remember is that it's not just about saying positive affirmations or lighting candles or, like calling yourself, something endearing like baby girl or what have you. That's very surface level. Okay. True reparenting is going to require you to do that inner work, the inner child work, and look at reinforcing boundary setting and what that means for you. Um, and often, this is the part that sometimes gets missed is that you have to allow yourself the space to grieve,
Mm,
um, because you're grieving what you didn't get. Okay. And you're grieving the child that you weren't able to be. There was you, a version of a child, and you weren't able to actually be in that version of yourself truly.
right.
So you're
Right.
mourning that loss.
Right.
And that's important as a process to go through for sure. So
Right.
it is reparenting. I think, yes, it can be, and it can be very healing, but you just have to make sure you're not doing a surface level thing with it.
Right.
You've got to do the work.
Right. Love that. Love that. Love that.
Mhm.
Here's another one I saw on TikTok. Uh, what's your
Yeah.
take on somatic shaking or trauma release workouts?
Okay. So let me say, okay, there's something very ancient and wise in
Right.
the idea of shaking off trauma.
Agree.
Okay.
Yes.
Animals do it,
Right.
right? We see indigenous rituals, tribal rituals that have long used movement and rhythm to release emotional energy.
Right.
That said, trauma is very complex,
Right.
right? And somatic practices, or in this case, like you're asking, somatic shaking, can definitely help with discharging the stress, but it's not always going to hit the underlying wound,
Right,
right?
right,
You've got to unpack it a bit more. Um, Let me tell you that the first time I went through a somatic yoga class, like the first time I actually did it, it didn't actually happen as somatic yoga. Okay. Because I told you it was part of my dance training, right?
right.
And so I actually got certified to be an instructor and what have you. And then I started to look into how yoga can help with trauma processing and what have you. And I, experiment with different poses with myself and see, like what's happening where. And the first time I just like found it, I found the move for me that just hit that button. And I kid you not, it was like, I, it was this was happening on,
Oh,
like I was
wow.
crying, and
Right.
it wasn't like an uncontrollable cry for me or anything like that. It was just water coming out of my eyes, and I didn't even know,
Wow.
like I wasn't even having
Mm,
like that visceral reaction of, like it wasn't that. It was just happening, right? So it was like I pushed a button somehow, through that release, and
right.
my body just started to let go. And the
Mm,
best way I could describe it for me was I was releasing, I was letting it go, right? And so what did I need to do? I needed to figure out the movement and that moment to be able to kind of nurture that and hold that space for myself so that I could just let it all out and let it go. And that was phenomenal.
amazing.
So, like, did that then give me the space to continue talking about it and unpacking it for myself? Absolutely.
Right.
So, when we look at somatic wellness or somatic practices, and specifically in this context, shaking, can it help? Absolutely. Does it work for everybody? Maybe not.
Right.
Maybe
Right.
it's not shaking for one person. Maybe it's finding that yoga move,
Right.
like
Right.
that position, whatever. So yeah, I would say that it can definitely help. I would encourage everybody who's interested to look at the right, by a professional somatic practices, somatic movement based practices, because whatever speaks to you, man, can it really help with enhancing what your journey is. Yeah.
Incredible. Incredible. Incredible.
Yeah.
Very interesting. This
Hmm.
is one that I've been wondering, and this is going to be controversial for some people. Have affirmations been overhyped or do they genuinely work?
I think I'm missing out in an industry because, when you hop on Amazon and you
Right.
type in affirmation cards, there's
Yes.
like a bazillion of them, and they're all selling a bazillion of them.
Bazillion of them.
I
Yes.
mean,
These are facts. Yes. Yes.
yeah. So, what is it overhyped? I mean, affirmations can definitely be supportive. I think the practice of daily gratitude is, and affirmations for yourself, whatever again resonates with you, is important.
Right.
Um, but again, what did I say? Resonate with
Right.
you, right?
Right.
It's got to be congruent. You've got to be able to get to a place where you're finding your own lexicon for reinforcing commentary like I'm
Right.
enough,
Right. Right.
and sometimes when you see the affirmations in the more superficial way, you're going to look at it and be like, I don't believe that. So that can create more friction. But whenever you feel that friction in spaces where it feels like it's
Mm,
overhyped or overused, I want you to ask yourself why, you know, because
mm,
that's where the work has got to be happening a little bit more. So have affirmations been overhyped, or do they genuinely work? I think they work, but you've got to find the right balance for yourself,
right.
and you don't want to force feed yourself stuff,
Right.
um, or overdo force feeding yourself stuff. Like you might have to take baby steps with it, like everything else. Take one step at a time with it, and maybe pick one. And maybe it's not an affirmation, maybe it's a mantra, maybe it's a saying, maybe it's you saying, I'm going to decide on a life motto, you know,
Mm,
And then that becomes your affirmation for the time being.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I want to transition from trends to our Reddit
Hmm.
rabbit hole. Speaking of Reddit, it's a place I spend a ton of time on. We're going to
Uh-huh.
jump into the Reddit rabbit hole and read some questions that we found in subreddits for you to answer.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
So this first one was actually in the trauma therapy subreddit, and the
Okay.
person starts off with saying bilateral stimulation anyone. And I'm not going to read all of it. I'm going to read just parts of it so that you can get the kind of overall review. So they say, I've been in trauma therapy for some months now, and we're working on negative cognitions. We're doing bilateral stimulation and the butterfly exercise to process my memories. Does anyone else find this helpful? Like when your therapist tells you to focus on where you feel the trauma in your body, do you focus on the physical feelings, or does your mind wander about the memory, and how to reframe it into something positive? They go on, for a little bit longer, but they go on with the final question of what is your personal experience with trauma therapy, and what are you and your therapist doing to process the memories?
Hmm. That's a great one. So, what would you like me to answer?
I
There's a
would
lot.
love the first
There's a lot.
first part first. Bilateral stimulation. If you could explain what that is for people who don't know, and the butterfly exercise, and is that helpful? Is that something that has worked? And then also, what are some other things that people do in trauma therapy?
Yeah. So, okay. So, bilateral stimulation, let me break this down for you. I mean, the basic thing with bilateral stimulation is there are some different ways of looking at it.
Okay.
So before I get there, let's go
Yes.
let's go to the other question that you
Okay.
asked for me,
Yes.
the one that the secondary one. I think that's the better place to start.
Yes. Yes. Yes, they asked. So what they said was like when your therapist tells you to focus on where you feel the trauma in your body, do you focus on physical feelings, or does your mind wander about the memory and reframe it into something positive?
Yeah.
And,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
what else are people doing in trauma therapy is kind of the
Yeah,
connection.
yeah. Okay. So let me start there because the whole idea of your mind wandering when you're going through some type of an exercise. Let me take like that 100,000 foot view
Right.
is completely natural. We even say
Mm,
that with yoga, where when you sit there and you're sitting in savasana and there's this feeling like you've got to clear your mind in order to,
right.
to be
Right.
enlightened. But actually, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to have all those thoughts coming to the surface because what you're doing is you're giving yourself that space to actually be able to breathe and open up,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
So you're essentially creating an environment where you're holding space for yourself.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Bilateral stimulation is a technique that's commonly used in trauma therapy, especially in EMDR, or for those of you who don't know, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy.
Okay.
And what that involves is getting both sides of the brain, the left and the right hemispheres, into this pattern, an alternating rhythmic pattern that's done through eye movements, through tactile input by tapping on the hands or the knees,
Right.
with auditory cues, so having alternating tones in each ear with headphones. And the reason why it's used in trauma therapy is because it can help with getting those post traumatic memories that are stuck and fragmented in the brain get processed. Okay.
Right.
Um, it can help with reducing emotional intensity which is
Mm,
associated oftentimes with those memories. It can promote integration of
right.
thoughts and emotions and body sensations. So what you ideally you want to move from a place where it's like you're feeling things sensation wise, but then you're understanding what that means from an emotional side. And then that helps with like the reintegration of all of those aspects of yourself for
Right.
yourself.
Right.
And then it gives you a little, arguably, a little more access to how you adapt to situations, even in times of distress. Okay.
Mm.
So that's kind of the purpose. That's why I had to take a little bit of
Right,
a
right. Makes
backtrack
sense.
to like start from there. In simpler terms, what we're looking to do with bilateral stimulation is get the brain out of being stuck in trauma loops
Okay.
and get back into a sense of flow, right?
Wow.
We're hoping that it's a tool that creates rhythm so that the nervous system can regulate, not in a bad way, in a not in a toxic way, not in a loopy way, essentially.
Right, right.
And we want the memory to shift from feeling overwhelmed to feeling like it's something that's manageable for you.
Got
Okay.
it. Got it.
So, so that being said, when somebody is saying, I'm feeling all the stuff come up, technically that's what you need to be able to tease it
Mm.
out and then say, now I know how to piece it apart.
Got it.
Right? Now I know how to piece it apart. I can lay it all out on the table. I can understand how each of these elements actually impact me, the way I react to things, where they're creating barriers to my own healing process and to my day-to-day living, my
Yes.
daily living. Um, so that's why I say it's natural. Like first thing when we go to bed, forget about therapy. When we go to bed, the first thing that happens oftentimes for people is what? Everything that you got to
Everything.
do comes to the surface, and you're
All the
like, ooh,
things.
yeah, I gotta write this note. I gotta do this. I didn't send that email. Blah, 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 blah. Here's all
Right,
the stuff, right?
right,
Because what are you doing? You're creating space for that to happen, right? So, in this particular form of therapy, it's literally formulated to try to activate a system to be able to re navigate what feels overwhelming into
right,
something that is manageable.
right. Amazing, amazing, amazing.
Yes.
I want to do one more before we go
Hmm.
into what's in the bag.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this one. So, this was in trauma therapy too. It says,
Mhm.
is it normal for things that don't necessarily involve me to affect me? So, they go on to say, so there's been a lot of fighting and arguing at home throughout my childhood, but I've never been involved in these fights or arguments. It's always been my dad and my sister. Well, I've just had to listen and take care of my younger brother. Is it normal that this affects me, or am I just overreacting?
No, of course it's normal that that you're reacting to it. And the reason why is what I want that person to explore.
Mm,
Why does it bother you?
yes.
Here's the thing, like we get to this place, it's like, oh my gosh, am I just overreacting about this? Or like, what's going on? Wait a second. The fact that you're actually asking that question means that it's already affected you. And you're like, I am frustrated with the fact that I feel like I might be overreacting to something,
Mm, yes.
right?
Yes.
Well, but why,
Right.
let's take a couple steps back and let's think about why it's bothering you. And
Right.
that's completely okay, right?
Right.
I'm going to take another 100,000 foot view answer to that question and say, we fear healing.
Yeah. So true.
Okay. And what gets bad, we were talking about toxic positivity, like what gets bad is when we put this expectation on ourselves that feeling anything but happy and joy is bad.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
No,
Yeah.
you know, no, we're humans and we came with, thankfully, a full range of emotions, right?
Exactly. It's so true.
We know we're alive when we feel bad, when we
Right.
feel
Right.
good, when we feel sadness, when we feel joy, when we feel fear, right?
Right.
When we feel safe. What I'm going to say right now is we need to now give ourselves permission to feel.
Right. 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 I love that. I think
So,
it's so
so
important.
that's that. Yeah, I mean, like, so that's the overarching answer that I would give to that person. And then more specifically, I would say, don't worry about whether or not you're overreacting. Of course, be appropriate and be safe. But, and if something's happening there, again, get help if you need it. But ask yourself why.
Yeah. So powerful. So powerful. I want to transition on that note to our
Yeah.
final segment, which is what is in your bag. So
Yeah.
I know you brought a
Yeah.
few things to show us. So Dr.
Uh-huh.
Mala, what's
Oh,
in your bag?
I don't know if I have well, definitely my AirPods. I don't have my purse with me right now, but I can tell you what
Yes,
I have in
tell
my
us.
bag. Yeah. Okay. So, I do have something in my drawer
Yes,
that I can share with
yes.
everybody. So I love this. This is
You do a little drum roll. Boo boo doo doo.
yeah. So I love a bit, and this is, I don't know if you can call this product placement. They don't sponsor me by any any means, but I would take it
It's
if they
okay.
wanted to. Aveda makes
Okay.
these beautiful chakra balancers, and there's a
Ooh.
whole set of seven,
Okay.
okay,
Okay.
to align with the seven different chakras. And I have all seven. I
Okay.
have duplicates of some, and I carry one in my purse all the time.
I love
So
that. I didn't know about these.
yeah, yeah.
All right.
They're amazing. They're amazing. And what happened, like, what's really interesting is like if you did it in the store, they would take you through this chakra
Okay.
journey and they would spray each one, and the one that resonates with you is the one that you need a little bit more of. So, for example, the one that I have in my hand right now is chakra 3, and they've labeled it as feeling intention.
Ooh.
And when you smell it, like it's supposed to reinforce that sense of intention and, positivity and all that good stuff. My other favorite one is 2, which is heart based. And I love it. I love it. So again, I love it because it's really based on like where you're at in the moment. So it reinforces present mindedness, but it also is just like based on your likes and, preferences. So yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I
I
love
have
it.
that. Yeah, I have that in my purse. Of course, I have my wallet. I usually have a lip balm. Let's see. I do have some gum in there.
Me too.
And then I have a pocket version
Okay.
of Shakespeare's sonnets.
No way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have definitely photos of my babies and my husband.
Aw,
So
I love this. I
yeah.
love it. It's always so interesting to me. Like there's always those wild card items too, that I'm like, oh, I love the sonnets.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing. Amazing. Now, before we let you go, I would love for you to walk through all of the beautiful, rich, juicy things that you're working on and how we can find you online too.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, things I'm working on right now. My through the Synergy Center, I've got a whole bunch of different training tools that are going to be coming out for providers and individuals who are just wellness enthusiasts. So keep your eyes open for that. I am working on a little something that may involve some writing that may
Woo!
end up in a bound copy somewhere on a shelf at some point. So that is coming.
I love
Um,
it.
and then and then at recovery.com, we're always working on all the tools to be able to try to get people to connect to treatment. So visit recovery.com, which is also one of the websites I was going to
Right.
let you guys know if you're looking for treatment, looking for education, on that journey, the patient journey, looking for a treatment center, and figuring out, what your recovery journey can look like. So really just an invaluable resource there. Where you can find me. So my social handles are at the official Dr. Mala on every platform. And my website. So it's drmala.net is my personal one. And then if you're looking for services for the Synergy Center, it's thesynergycenter.net.
Amazing. 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 Dr. Mala, thank you so much. You're just such a wellspring of information and heart
Mhm.
and soul, and you've just done so much to impact people in a beautiful, positive way and to help them overcome, difficult situations. So thank you for being a beacon of light and for holding space for so many people. It's just The world needs more people like you. So thank
Oh,
you.
thank
Thank
you
you.
so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you so much for having me, Teju. And it was really an honor to be here. I loved this time. So
Thank
thank
you.
you so
Me
much.
too.
And thank you for all the work that you are doing as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Virtual hugs.
Yeah, I
Till
love it.
next
Love it.
time.
Yeah, yeah. Sounds
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you.